right track, and I am with you. As to Henry's part, he added, I'll make Henry my watchdog. Since Harkness was also a director of banks, railroads, mining, real estate, and manufacturing companies, the tie ushered Rockefeller into a new universe of business connections. On March 4, 1867, the Cleveland Leader announced the formation of a new partnership, Rockefeller, Andrews, and Flagler, with offices in the Case Building, a solid masonry structure with rounded Romanesque windows and a prestigious address on the public square. This firm is one of the oldest in the refining business, and their trade already a mammoth one. Their establishment is one of the largest in the United States. Among the many oil refining enterprises, this seems to be one of the most successful. Its heavy capital and consummate management have kept it clear of the many shoals upon which oil refining houses have so often been stranded. From reading this description, one would have thought the firm was run by gray reverend men, whereas Rockefeller, the boy wonder of Cleveland business, was just 27. Starting with Flagler's recruitment, Rockefeller began to assemble the team of capable, congenial executives who would transform the Cleveland refiner into the world's strongest industrial company. Both Rockefeller and Flagler had nimble minds for numbers and infinite dexterity with balance sheets. Neither was interested in a modest success, and they were both prepared to go as far and as fast as the marketplace allowed. As Flagler boasted, I've always been contented, but I had never been satisfied. Rockefeller found his partner's enthusiasm a tonic, noting that Flagler was always on the active side of every question, and to his wonderful energy is due much of the rapid progress of the company in the early days. Given their exalted goals, it probably helped that Flagler had been chastened by failure and was acquainted with the perils of complacency. Rockefeller loved Flagler's dictum that a friendship founded on business was superior to a business founded on friendship. And for several decades they worked together in an almost seamless fashion. In the early years, the two men were bound by a common dream, lived near each other, and seemed virtually inseparable. As Rockefeller said in his memoirs, we met and walked to the office together, walked home to luncheon, back again after luncheon, and home again at night. On these walks, when we were away from the office interruptions, we did our thinking, talking, and planning together. For a man as reserved as Rockefeller, this picture suggests an unbuttoned exchange of ideas of a sort he permitted with few people. In the office, their intimacy was patent to visitors, for they had back-to-back desks and shared many duties. They even developed a collective letter-writing style, passing drafts back and forth with each making minor improvements until they expressed what was wanted, but not one syllable more. At this point, the letters were ready to be vetted by the severest judge, Mrs. Rockefeller, who was, said one office worker, known to be the most valued advisor. Endowed with considerable verbal skill, Flagler had such a gift for drawing up legal documents, or sniffing out hidden pitfalls in contracts, that Rockefeller insisted he could have taught the fine points of contract law to lawyers. No small edge for a firm that would be engaged in running legal battles. In his later years, Flagler developed into a grandee of such rich tastes that it is instructive to note his austere early style. Not only did he labor 6 days a week, but he shunned bars and theaters as the devil's playgrounds and became superintendent of the First Presbyterian Church. Like Rockefeller, he advocated self-discipline and deferred gratification. As he said of his first threadbare days in Cleveland, I wore a thin overcoat and thought how comfortable I should be when I could afford a long, thick ulster. I carried a lunch in my pocket until I was a rich man. I trained myself in the school of self-control and self-denial. It was hard on me, but I would rather be my own tyrant than have someone else tyrannize me. After his wife, Mary, gave birth to a son, Henry Harkness Flagler, in 1870, she never regained her health and turned into an invalid. For the next 17 years, Flagler stayed home at night so he could read to her for hours on end, with John and Laura Rockefeller often stopping by to mitigate the gloom. That Flagler was his most valuable partner was always unquestioned dogma for Rockefeller, yet one wonders whether the influence was altogether benign. An ebullient man, Flagler wouldn't stop to quibble over legal niceties when taken by a powerful idea, and even Rockefeller hinted obliquely at the dangers posed by Flagler's headstrong nature. He was a man of great force and determination, said Rockefeller, though perhaps he needed a restraining influence at times when his enthusiasm was roused. On his desk, Flagler kept a quote from a popular novel, David Harum, which said, "Do unto others as they would do unto you, and do it first." What makes Flagler's ethics consequential for Rockefeller's career was that he was the mastermind of many negotiations with the railroads, the single most controversial aspect of Standard Oil history. It's not clear that anyone could have tempered the fiercely irrepressible drive of John D. Rockefeller, but the swashbuckling Flagler had especially little interest in transposing the lessons of his Sunday school classes to the profane, turbulent world of oil refining. As far as Rockefeller was concerned, however, Flagler's arrival was providential, for the oil industry was about to be thrown into unprecedented turmoil, making relations with the railroads all important. Transportation assumed a pivotal place in the petroleum business for an elementary reason. Drake had discovered oil in a distant, inaccessible spot that was, at first, poorly served by the railroads. For several years, teamsters, the wagoners who hauled out the barrels, exercised a brutal tyranny and charged exorbitant sums. Since oil was a relatively cheap, standardized commodity, transportation costs inevitably figured as a critical factor in the competitive struggle. The logical and elegant solution, to construct a comprehensive pipeline network, encountered harsh resistance from the threatened teamsters. During the 1865 pit hole frenzy, Samuel Van Sickle laid a 2-inch iron pipeline from Oil Creek to railroad tracks 6 miles away. Defying armed guards, roaming gangs of teamsters descended each night and tore up sections of the pipeline. When Henry Harley launched a second pipeline, they again dug up pipes and set storage tanks ablaze, forcing Harley to field a small army of Pinkerton detectives to squash the revolt. The teamsters must have known they were fighting a rearguard action, but for a time they managed to delay the installation of a pipeline system. Between the benighted rule of the teamsters and the future domination by efficient pipelines, there arose an interregnum in which the railroads exercised pervasive influence over everything that happened in the industry. At first they tried to ship barrels on open flat cars, but the swaying, jolting ride splintered the containers and spilled their contents. After the Civil War, this hazardous method was superseded by primitive tank cars, twin pine tubs mounted on flat cars, that were soon replaced in turn by single iron tanks that became the industry norm. Such technical advances allowed the railroads to speed oil across the continent and vastly expanded the market for petroleum products. During the first few years, the oil business was so effortlessly profitable that refineries sprang up in 6 competing centers. The inland centers, the oil regions Pittsburgh and Cleveland, and the seaboard centers, New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, engaged in pitched battles to control the business. Favored by proximity to the wells, the western Pennsylvania refiners seemed to possess an incalculable edge. But they had to import chemicals, barrels, machinery, and labor, and therefore labored under distinct handicaps. Nonetheless, these refiners saved so much on transportation that they fancied they would emerge supreme in the oil business. Later, Rockefeller admitted that he'd been tempted to switch operations to Pennsylvania. Yet he and his partners didn't wish to uproot their families or write off their considerable investment in Cleveland. They also feared that the glory of the oil regions might soon fade into history, as Rockefeller later noted in a statement reminiscent of Percy Bysshe Shelley's poem Ozymandias. "You have seen Pit Hole and Petroleum Center, the places where once stood big, prosperous cities, in which men made millions of dollars out of oil. Now they are bits of wilderness, overgrown with weeds, and with nothing left to tell of their greatness but a few scattered parts of old houses and the memory of a few aged men. Prudent men did not want to place all their capital into business in such places." Even late in life, Rockefeller was loath to confess, for political reasons, the overriding reason for his attachment to Cleveland. It was the hub of so many transportation networks that he had tremendous room to maneuver in freight negotiations. During the summer months, he could send oil by water, greatly enhancing his bargaining power with the railroads. His firm could load their oil in the season of lake navigation and canal navigation upon vessels at Cleveland and from Buffalo by the Erie Canal, and could deliver the oil to their warehouses in New York at a cost lower than the current rates at which the railway companies had been seeking the business. Armed with this potent weapon, Rockefeller obtained such excellent railroad rates that it compensated for having to ship the crude oil to Cleveland before sending refined oil to the Atlantic coast, a far more circuitous route than shipping from Titusville straight to New York. Fed by rail links to Chicago, St. Louis, and Cincinnati, Cleveland also served as a natural gateway to western markets. Other Cleveland refiners evidently made the same calculation, and by late 1866, the city supported 50 refineries, ranking second only to Pittsburgh. Cleveland's refineries were so numerous that their foul, acrid atmosphere enveloped the outskirts, tainting the beer from local breweries and souring the milk. Besides access to the Erie Canal and Lake Erie, Cleveland was serviced by 3 main railroad lines that gave its inland refineries direct access to eastern ports: the New York Central, which ran north from New York City to Albany and then west to Buffalo, where its lakeshore line ran along Lake Erie to Cleveland; the Erie Railroad, which also sped across New York State to a point south of Buffalo, where its Atlantic and Great Western subsidiary headed down into Cleveland and the oil regions; and the august Pennsylvania Railroad, which went from New York and Philadelphia to Harrisburg and Pittsburgh. With virtuosic brilliance, Rockefeller and Flagler played these 3 railroads against each other in seemingly endless permutations. They even managed to manipulate such redoubtable figures as the notorious Jay Gould, who had wrested the Erie Railroad from Commodore Vanderbilt in 1868. Flagler singled out Gould as the fairest and squarest of the railroad chieftains in his dealings, and Rockefeller, when asked to name the greatest businessman he had ever met, instantly cited Gould. Gould himself later asserted that John D. Rockefeller had possessed the highest genius for constructive organization in American economic history. Before long, the various oil refining centers were rushing to form tactical alliances with these railroad networks. As a natural outgrowth of their root structure, the New York Central and the Erie wanted to promote Cleveland as a refining center and regarded Rockefeller as a critical ally in efforts to boost their oil freight business. With easy access to the oil fields via the Allegheny River, Pittsburgh might have seemed the optimal location, but its refiners were always held hostage to the freight monopoly of the Pennsylvania Railroad. Following a myopic and ultimately destructive policy toward Pittsburgh, the Pennsylvania Railroad decided it was more profitable to carry crude oil from Oil Creek all the way to Philadelphia or New York refineries, rather than to have it refined in Pittsburgh. By penalizing Pittsburgh refiners with crushing rates, the railroad fattened its short-term profits but sacrificed the city's future as a refining center and paved the way for the hegemony of the city the Pennsylvania wanted most to eradicate, Cleveland. As Rockefeller later said, the Pennsylvania Railroad's attitude made it easy for him to find common cause with its arch-rivals, and he forged a cabal with the New York Central and the Erie that the Pennsylvania was hard-pressed to stop. By the late 1860s, the press was rife with reports that the Pennsylvania Railroad had decreed that Cleveland would be wiped out as a refining center as with a sponge, a statement forever engraved on Rockefeller's unforgiving memory. Taking this as a declaration of war, he was emboldened to respond with the most robust countermeasures at his command. He was a man who always acted on Flagler's business motto of favoring sharp, vigorous, and decisive measures. The Pennsylvania statement set off a panic-stricken reaction in Cleveland as local refiners prepared to transfer their operations to Oil Creek. Cool-headed in the face of such hysteria, Rockefeller saw that he could convert this chaos to advantage. By threatening to strip the others of their oil traffic, the Pennsylvania had placed the Erie and New York Central in a vulnerable position, and Rockefeller and Flagler decided to use this leverage to wring extreme concessions from them. In the spring of 1868, Jay Gould hatched a secret deal with Rockefeller and Flagler that gave them shares in a subsidiary company called the Allegheny Transportation Company, which was the first major pipeline network serving Oil Creek. Through this deal, the Cleveland refiners received a staggering 75% rebate on oil shipped through the Erie system. As part of this extraordinary bonanza, Flagler also cut a deal with the Atlantic and Great Western, an Erie subsidiary, that gave Rockefeller, Andrews, and Flagler highly advantageous rates on rail shipments between Cleveland and the oil regions. In this season of bountiful concessions, Flagler also approached General J.H. Devereux, the newly installed vice president of the Lake Shore Railroad, which formed part of the New York Central system. Trained as a civil engineer, Devereux had revamped the railroad system in Northern Virginia to assist the Union Army and was commended by Lincoln for his work. In negotiating a new framework with him, Rockefeller and Flagler argued for preferential rates that would more than match discounts extended by the Pennsylvania Railroad to its customers in the oil regions. In other words, the young Cleveland refiners cannily converted their geographic disadvantage into a powerful bargaining tool and secured covert rates that allowed them to ship crude oil to Cleveland and then refined oil to New York for only $1.65 per barrel, compared to an officially listed rate of $2.40 per barrel. In exchange for this extraordinary concession, Rockefeller and Flagler didn't simply try to squeeze the railroads. They were much too shrewd and subtle for that. but offered compelling incentives. For instance, they agreed to assume legal liability for fire or other accidents and stop using water transport during the summer months. The biggest plum they dangled before Devereux was a promise to supply the lakeshore with an astonishing 60 carloads of refined oil daily. Since Rockefeller lacked the refining capacity to fulfill this ambitious pledge, he was evidently prepared to coordinate shipments with other Cleveland refiners.
Bro. I don't know how
For any railroad, the prospect of steady shipments was irresistible. They could dispatch trains composed solely of oil tank cars instead of a motley assortment of freight cars picking up different products at different places. By consolidating many small shippers into one big shipper, making regular uniform shipments in massive quantities, the railroads could reduce the average round-trip time of their trains to New York from 30 days to 10, and operate a fleet of 600
Well, it does
cars
matter how it
instead of
happens,
1,800.
but that's just secondary.
Never shy about his accomplishments, Rockefeller knew that he had broached a revolutionary deal. It was a large, regular volume of business, such as had not hitherto been given to the roads in question. From that moment, the railroads acquired a vested interest in the creation of a gigantic oil monopoly that would lower their costs, boost their profits, and generally simplify their lives. As in other industries, the railroads developed a stake in the growth of big businesses whose economies of scale permitted them to operate more efficiently, an ominous fact for small, struggling refiners who were gradually weeded out in the savage competitive strife. Without doubt, the Lakeshore deal marked a turning point for Rockefeller, the oil industry, and the entire American economy. Decades later, Ida Tarbell condemned it as Rockefeller's original sin from which all others sprang. Mr. Rockefeller certainly saw by 1868 that he had no legitimate superiority over those competing with him in Cleveland, which would ever enable him to be anything more than one of the big men in his line. Only Rockefeller's willingness to cheat and cut corners, Tarbell contended, had enabled him to outdistance the pack. This claim, echoed by Rockefeller's most virulent critics, overstates the case, for even before Rockefeller accepted his first rebate, he was the world's largest refiner, equal in size to the next three largest Cleveland refineries combined. In fact, it was the unparalleled scope of his operation that had enabled him to cut this exceptional deal in the first place. Tarbell perceived correctly, however, that the principal advantage of Rockefeller's commanding position was that it meant special power to compel railroad freight concessions. In closing their historic deal, Rockefeller and Flagler suffered no twinges of conscience and were frankly elated by their triumph. "I remember when the Standard received its first rebate," said Flagler. "I went home in great delight. I had won a great victory, I thought." But they knew they had dabbled in a dark and controversial practice, for the rebates were predicated on great secrecy. Many years later, Rockefeller explained to one railroad negotiator that their dealings with the Lakeshore rested on oral agreements that were never committed to paper. "Our people do not think it would be best for the Lakeshore Road or us to have a contract, but with the good faith between us and desire to promote each other's interests, we can serve each other better by being able to say we have no contracts." Because many railroad deals ended with a handshake, not a signature, Rockefeller could breezily deny their existence without fear of embarrassing reputations later on. As the chief transportation deal maker, Flagler had overseen the Landmark Pact, and Rockefeller always credited him for it. Some of this derived from Rockefeller's humility, but it also betrayed a lifelong habit of covering his tracks and pretending to be elsewhere when critical decisions were made. Although Rockefeller didn't lead the Lakeshore negotiations, he was smack in the thick of them. On August 19, 1868, he sent a fascinating letter to SETI from New York that shows his toughness vis-a-vis the Vanderbilts, who controlled the New York Central, the Lakeshore's parent. "We were sent for by Mr. Vanderbilt yesterday at 12 o'clock and did not go. He is anxious to get our business and said he could meet us on the terms. We sent our card by the messenger that Vanderbilt might know where to find our office later." The point is worth underscoring. 29-year-old John D. Rockefeller demanded that 74-year-old Commodore Vanderbilt, the emperor of the railroad world, come to him. This refusal to truckle, bend, or bow to others, this insistence on dealing with other people on his own terms, time and turf, distinguished Rockefeller throughout his career. Bolstered by the Lakeshore deal, Cleveland soon surpassed Pittsburgh as the leading refining center, and for the first time, journalists began to track Rockefeller's ascendancy. In 1869, one writer marveled at the power that this laconic young man, in his understated manner, had already attained in Cleveland. He occupies a position in our business circles second to but few. Close application to one kind of business, and avoidance of all positions of honorary character that cost time, keeping everything pertaining to his business in so methodical a manner that he knows every night how he stands with the world. Today, an arcane forgotten subject, the issue of railroad rebates generated heated debate in post-Civil War America, since they directly affected the shape of the economy and the distribution of wealth. Railroads had obtained the power to produce either a concentrated economy with progressively larger business units, or to perpetuate the small-scale economy of antebellum America. The proliferation of rebates hastened the shift toward an integrated national economy, top-heavy with giant companies enjoying preferential freight rates. Rockefeller justly argued that he hadn't invented the rebate and that the Pennsylvania Railroad had granted thousands of them in the 6 years before his seminal Lake Shore deal. It was a common practice in all descriptions of freighting, not peculiar to oil, in merchandise, grain, everything. Rebates had inevitably accompanied railroad expansion. As the total railroad trackage doubled to 70,000 miles within 8 years after the Civil War, the roads were saddled with high fixed costs and heavy bonded debt. This forced them to maintain a high, steady freight volume to stay alive, and waylaid them into vicious rate wars. Rebates weren't just solicited by shippers, but were sedulously pushed by railway freight agents eager to win over new business. Rebates enabled them to maintain the fiction of listed rates while secretly giving discounts to favored shippers. Over time, relations grew ever closer and more incestuous between the railroads and large shippers. For decades, Rockefeller and his colleagues enjoyed free passes on all major railroads, which they regarded not as payoffs, but as natural perquisites of their business. Rockefeller never saw rebates as criminal or illegitimate or as favors secured only by bullying monopolies. He was correct in stating that listed rates were always a farce, a starting point for haggling. Many refiners received rebates, not just the leading firms, and some tiny rivals actually got superior discounts, especially from the Pennsylvania Railroad. Rockefeller's business papers display much internal grumbling about this presumed inequity, for which he and his colleagues regularly chastised railroad officials at critical moments in negotiations. But in spite of numerous scattered cases of rival refiners getting comparable rebates, no other firm received so many rebates so consistently over so many years or on such a colossal scale as Rockefeller's. It was therefore disingenuous of him to suggest that rebates played only an incidental role in his success. So were Ida Tarbell and other detractors justified in tarring Rockefeller's whole career based on railroad rebates? Unfortunately, the controversy was played out in a gray area of ethics and the law that makes a definitive answer impossible. From a strictly economic standpoint, Rockefeller rested on solid ground when he insisted that bulk shippers deserved a discount. Who can buy beef the cheapest? The housewife for her family, the steward for a club or hotel, or the commissary for an army? Who is entitled to better rebates from a railroad? Those who give it 5,000 barrels a day, or those who give 500 barrels, or 50 barrels? Besides providing a steady flow of oil shipments, Rockefeller's firm invested heavily in warehouses, terminals, loading platforms, and other railroad facilities, so that the roads probably derived more profit from his shipments than from those of rivals who paid higher rates. Small, irregular shippers were the bane of railroads, for the simple mechanical reason that they forced the trains to stop repeatedly to pick up single carloads of oil. To meet the terms of his deal with the Lake Shore, Rockefeller had to run his refineries at full capacity, even when kerosene demand slackened. He therefore paid a price for his rebates and felt that equal rates for all shippers would have unfairly penalized his firm. Perhaps because Ida Tarbell trained a glaring spotlight on the rebate issue, Rockefeller insisted vehemently in later interviews that the real profitability of his firm lay elsewhere. In an intriguing aside in later years, he even hinted that the clamor over rebates conveniently deflected public attention away from other, more profitable aspects of his operation. Along this line, much was said about rebates and drawbacks for long years, and the Standard Oil Company knew full well that the public were not on the right scent. They knew where their profits came from, but they did not deem it wise to inform the public, and especially their competitors, of the real secret sources of their strength. Indeed, one can argue that the obsession among reformers with the rebate issue might have blinded them to a multitude of other sins. Not until the Interstate Commerce Act in 1887 did it become an illegal, punishable offense for railroads to give rebates. The practice didn't cease entirely until the 1903 Elkins Act. Nevertheless, by the end of the Civil War, a widespread belief had begun to take hold that railroads were common carriers and should shun favoritism. Ida Tarbell cited provisions in the Pennsylvania State Constitution that, as she interpreted them, compelled railroads to serve as common carriers and avoid discrimination. Yet in the last analysis, she based her withering critique of Rockefeller less on specific laws than on her belief that he had violated a sense of fair play. That is, she wrote in McClure's magazine in July 1905, rebate giving then as now was regarded as one of those lower business practices which characterizes commerce at all periods, and against which men of honor struggle, and of which men of greed take advantage. In the privacy of his study in 1917, an unrepentant Rockefeller disputed her view of the prevailing business ethics. I deny that it was regarded as a dishonorable practice for a merchant or manufacturer to obtain the best rates possible for his goods. As to Tarbell's charge that the secrecy of rebates proved their immorality, Rockefeller countered that railroads didn't wish to advertise discounts that might then be demanded by other shippers. For these arrangements were not, except by the academic, expected to be published, any more than the general of an army's plans are published to enable the enemy to defeat him. The most compelling argument against rebates was that railroads received state charters and therefore had the right of eminent domain, that is, the right to claim private property in order to lay down tracks, investing their activities with a public character. In 1867, a committee of the Ohio Senate declared that railroads, as common carriers, should charge equal rates, but a bill incorporating these ideas was defeated. The following year, just as Rockefeller implemented his Lake Shore deal, a Pennsylvania Senate committee reported that railroads were common carriers and had no right to show partiality among their customers. But again, no regulatory changes ensued. Almost 20 years passed before reformers succeeded in introducing public regulation that forced an end to the railroad favoritism that so incensed farmers and other small shippers across America. In the meantime, Rockefeller profited enormously from the failure of public authorities to rectify the iniquities of the transportation system, and his firm understandably kept up vigorous lobbying efforts to perpetuate the status quo. Chapter 7. Millionaire's Row. Rockefeller had speedily acquired a level of respectability that would have seemed unthinkable 15 years before, when he and his demoralized family were crowded into the Humiston House in Strongsville. In August 1868, after his rebate deal with the Lake Shore Railroad, he certified his enhanced status in Cleveland when he and Seti moved from Cheshire Street to a solid brick home at 424 Euclid Avenue. This move dramatized the immense distance he had traveled after a few years in the oil business. Local boosters had already tagged Euclid Avenue the most beautiful street in the world, with homes that lavishly mirrored the local fortunes in oil, iron, banking, timber, railroads, and real estate. All of the town's new opulence was reflected in this street of massive houses. The residential address for such local luminaries as Henry B. Payne, Amasa Stone, and John Hay, Euclid Avenue claimed so many mansions that it had richly earned its sobriquet of Millionaire's Row. With the spacious grandeur of a fine Victorian street, always busy with fashionable horses and carriages, the wide avenue had a double row of elms that created a tall, shady canopy overhead. The imposing homes were deeply recessed from the street, their trimmed lawns and shapely shrubbery providing buffer zones between the houses and their distant front gates. Since few houses were separated from adjoining houses by fences, the street sometimes gave the impression of being a single flowing park, with elegant homes standing in an unbroken expanse of greenery. While Rockefeller's home looked small and cramped beside Amasa Stone's towering manse and other gaudy monstrosities, it was a substantial two-story structure with a mansard roof, a portico, and arched windows, shielded from the street by an iron picket fence that spanned its entire 116-foot frontage. Rockefeller could have afforded something showier than this $40,000 house, and pedestrians might have thought its owner a lesser light in business. Yet this was exactly the misimpression that he wanted to convey. Far from trying to parade his wealth, he wanted to blend into the scenery. Even at home, Rockefeller was discreet and behaved as if he was concealing some secret from prying eyes. Beyond that, he had the Puritan's discomfort with possessions, a nagging Baptist anxiety that decoration might appear idolatrous. Again, like Weber's ideal capitalist, He avoids ostentation and unnecessary expenditure, as well as conscious enjoyment of his power, and is embarrassed by the outward signs of the social recognition which he receives. Fond of roomy, ungainly houses that he could remodel ceaselessly, Rockefeller would have been stymied by a house that required no improvement. Utilitarian by nature, he was more concerned with the grounds and interiors of homes than with the subtleties of architectural ornamentation. "I hate frills," he once said. "Useful things, beautiful things are admirable, but frills, affectations, mere pretenses of being something very fine, bore me very much." With a country boy's love of open spaces, he hated anything confined or cluttered, and probably chose the Euclid Avenue house for its large, high-ceilinged rooms, which included a parlor, a sitting room, and a dining room downstairs, plus 4 bedrooms upstairs. Rockefeller devoted more time and expense to the trees and shrubbery than to the house itself. To expand his gardens, he bought an adjoining lot but was disturbed by the house that came with it and obstructed his view. Since he detested waste, he donated the house to a new girls' school being built a block away. In what was hailed as an engineering wonder at the time, the brick house was jacked up by a windlass and rolled down the block on greased logs, a spectacle that was covered by local papers and drew spectators. Mr. Rockefeller set the house on new foundations where it was as good as ever, Lucy Spellman said of her brother-in-law's feat. This was a marvelous undertaking, but then he was always undertaking marvelous things. Behind the house, he built a stone stable and coach house more magnificent than the residence itself. Over 100 feet long, it had stout beams, pine panels, and elaborate chandeliers. An expert driver with either a pair of horses or a four in hand, Rockefeller had a passion for trotters, and Euclid Avenue provided a perfect straightaway for races. If anybody tried to pass him, the hyper-competitive Rockefeller automatically turned it into a trial of speed. John, William, and Frank were stockholders in a racing club called the Cleveland Driving Park Company, the first amateur club of its sort in America. Unable to do anything in a casual manner, Rockefeller became obsessive about his hobbies, which he could sometimes indulge in extravagant fashion. In the 1870s, his records show, he paid stupendous sums, from $10,000 to $12,500, for thoroughbred trotters with such evocative names as Midnight, Flash, Jessie, Baron, and Trifle. In his early days in business, Rockefeller often suffered from severe neck pains that might have indicated stress on the job, and he turned to horses as a therapeutic diversion. "I would leave my office in the afternoon and drive a pair of fast horses as hard as they could go. Trot, break, gallop, everything." Since SETI was also fond of horses, they often rode together. His style of racing was also revealing. He never applied cruel, coercive measures to recalcitrant horses, but studied them closely and tried to coax them along gently and with great patience. "I remember when my brother William and I used to go riding," he said. "I would invariably come in first. He would be covered with perspiration, as was his horse. My horse would be too, but I would be as cool as I am now. I always would talk to my horses, quietly, steadily, never get excited." This unflappable style and conservation of energy also characterized his approach to the management of his vast oil empire. Unlike his philandering father, John D. Rockefeller remained firmly, almost prudishly anchored in domestic life. Much like Jay Gould, who didn't drink, smoke, or gallivant with women, Rockefeller's harsh business tactics were counterbalanced by exemplary behavior at home, where he was a sweet, respectful Victorian husband. To borrow a line from Flaubert, to be fiercely revolutionary in business, he needed to be utterly conventional at home. Eternally at war with the devil, John and SETI allowed their religious beliefs to define their entire cultural agenda. They subscribed to seats at the Philharmonic, for instance, but theater and opera were too racy for these professing Christians. Shying away from social situations that weren't safely predictable, they socialized only within a small circle of family members, business associates, and church friends, and never went to clubs or dinner parties. "Club life did not appeal to me," said Rockefeller. "I was meeting all the people I needed to meet in my day's work. My family would rather have me at home, even if I were snoring in an easy chair, than going out for the evening, and certainly I preferred to stay at home." He especially enjoyed the company of ministers whose genial, homiletic style matched his own. Thus walled off from temptation, Rockefeller was virtually untouched by the decadence of the Gilded Age. Much of Rockefeller's preference for home life stemmed from his strict temperance views. Even late in life, he accepted an invitation to a hotel barbecue, then went to investigate the site beforehand. When he spotted empty beer bottles on the premises, he promptly withdrew his acceptance. Since he and SETI were deeply involved in temperance work, they did everything from sponsoring lecture tours to lobbying to have temperance principles inserted in school textbooks. They avoided the very presence of liquor, and thus severely cramped their social activities. Yet within their circumscribed world, they had a happy home life. Rockefeller bridled at the notion that he was a business-obsessed drudge, a slave to the office. "I know of nothing more despicable and pathetic than a man who devotes all the waking hours of the day to making money for money's sake," he reported in his memoirs. He worked at a more leisurely pace than many other executives, napping daily after lunch and often dozing in a lounge chair after dinner. To explain his extraordinary longevity, he later said, doubtless overstating the matter, "I'm here because I shirked, did less work, lived more in the open air, enjoyed the open-air sunshine and exercise." By his mid-30s, he had installed a telegraph wire between home and office so that he could spend 3 or 4 afternoons each week at home, planting trees, gardening, and enjoying the sunshine. Rockefeller didn't do this in a purely recreational spirit, but mingled work and rest to pace himself and improve his productivity. In time, he became something of an evangelist on health-related issues. "It is remarkable how much we all could do if we avoid hustling and go along at an even pace and keep from attempting too much." There was a clockwork regularity about Rockefeller's life that made it seem mechanical to outsiders, but that he found soothing. He didn't seem to require time to indulge normal human idleness, much less illicit passion. In his rigidly compartmentalized life, each hour was tightly budgeted, whether for business, religion, family, or exercise. Perhaps these daily rituals helped him to deal with underlying tensions that might otherwise have become ungovernable. For although he tried to project an air of unhurried calm, he was under terrific strain in creating his oil empire. He fretted endlessly about his company and, below the surface, was constantly on edge. In one of his few admissions of weakness, he recalled that, "For years on end, I never had a solid night's sleep, worrying about how it was to come out. I tossed about in bed night after night, worrying over the outcome. All the fortune that I have made has not served to compensate for the anxiety of that period." By the time they moved to Euclid Avenue, the Rockefellers already had one child, Elizabeth, always called Bessie, who was born in the Cheshire Street house in 1866. When SETI was confined during childbirth and couldn't attend church, John jotted down notes on the sermon and read them back to her afterward. All of the remaining children were born in an upstairs bedroom at Euclid Avenue. Their second child, Alice, was born in July 1869, but died a year later. Then came Alta, 1871, Edith, 1872, and John Jr., 1874. They were delivered by a pioneering physician, Dr. Myra Herrick, Cleveland's first woman doctor, who organized a short-lived homeopathic college to train women in the field. When she set up a free medical dispensary staffed exclusively by female doctors to assist low-income women, SETI and Mary Flagler were prominent contributors. A surprisingly flexible, egalitarian father, Rockefeller never shrank from child care. His sister-in-law, Lute, who gave up teaching and went to live with them, told how John eased the burden from SETI's shoulders when he was at home. He would get up from his nap the moment he heard a baby cry and carry the little one up and down the room until she was quieted. Rockefeller was always patient with his children and seldom lost his temper or uttered a harsh word. As the son of a self-absorbed absentee father, he made a point of being an affectionate parent and something of a homebody. Like Big Bill, however, Rockefeller could be a sprightly companion for his children. He would get down on all fours and bear them on his back, recapturing a boyish glee that was seldom evident at the office. When they played blind man's buff, he electrified them with daring feints, sudden thrusts, and unexpected wheeling turns, followed by whoops of delight when he won. Attuned to their fantasy world, he liked to gather the children around him and tell fairy tales. Also like his father, he had an inexhaustible supply of stunts. At dinner, he dazzled the children by balancing fine china plates on the tip of his nose. He also balanced crackers on his nose, then gave them a sudden flip and caught them in his mouth. He taught the children to swim, row, skate, and ride, and he had a talent for devising imaginative outings. On moonlit nights at Forest Hill, the Cleveland estate Rockefeller bought in the 1870s, they ventured forth on bicycle trips, with Rockefeller pinning a large white handkerchief to the back of his coat and leading the children through winding, mysterious forest roads. John Jr. never forgot skating with his father. The lake was deep, so we took under each arm long, narrow boards, which would hold us up in case we broke through the ice. That was characteristic of Father. He always took the utmost care to examine any project thoroughly. Then, when convinced it was safe, put it through without further question. Perhaps to create a substitute for theater and other entertainments prescribed by their religion, John and Seti encouraged the children's musical talents, and each one took up an instrument. They formed their own quartet, with Bessie on violin, Walter on piano, Edith on cello, and John Jr. on violin, so that the house echoed with the works of Mozart, Beethoven, and Handel. The children approached music as serious art, not frivolous amusement, and performed frequently at church events. They weren't barred from playing contemporary popular music. If there was more merriment in Rockefeller's household than we might have suspected, there was also an underlying sobriety. His children remembered the playful moments, but outsiders were struck by the somber, stuffy atmosphere and found something almost spooky about the Rockefeller home, with one disgruntled tutor leaving this ghastly description. The elastic step, the laughter of youth, the lightheartedness, the romping about, the playfulness which one is supposed to meet among the young and happy, were entirely lacking almost to dejection. It was a gloomy horizon with a heaviness that pervaded the entire household, silence and gloom everywhere. Rockefeller kept his children hermetically cut off from the world and hired governesses to educate them at home. Aside from church, they never engaged in outside social or civic functions and betrayed a very Baptist fear of worldly entertainments. In the summertime, the children's friends might come to visit for a week or two at a time, but never the reverse. And even these playmates were the cautiously screened offspring of John and Seti's church companions. As John Jr. remembered, our interests centered in the house. Our friends came there almost wholly. We went rarely, practically none at all, to neighbors' houses. John Jr. hinted that the children brought to visit weren't real companions and were mostly window dressing to gratify his parents. We had no childhood friends, no school friends. It was a far cry from Thorsten Veblen's image of the spoiled leisure class. Convinced that struggle was the crucible of character, Rockefeller faced a delicate task in raising his children. He wanted to accumulate wealth while inculcating in them the values of his threadbare boyhood. The first step in saving them from extravagance was keeping them ignorant of their father's affluence. Until they were adults, Rockefeller's children never visited his office or refineries, and even then they were accompanied by company officials, never father. At home, Rockefeller created a make-believe market economy, calling Seti the general manager and requiring the children to keep careful account books. They earned pocket money by performing chores and received 2 cents for killing flies, 10 cents for sharpening pencils, 5 cents per hour for practicing their musical instruments, and $1 for repairing vases. They were given 2 cents per day for abstaining from candy and a dime bonus for each consecutive day of abstinence. Each toiled in a separate patch of the vegetable garden, earning a penny for every 10 weeds they pulled up. John Jr. got 15 cents an hour for chopping wood and 10 cents per day for superintending paths. Rockefeller took pride in training his children as miniature household workers. Years later, riding on a train with his 13-year-old daughter, he told a traveling companion, "This little girl is earning money already. You never could imagine how she does it. I have learned what my gas bills should average when the gas is managed with care. And I have told her that she can have for pin money all that she will save every month on this amount, so she goes around every night and keeps the gas turned down where it is not needed." Rockefeller never tired of preaching economy, and whenever a package arrived at home, he made a point of saving the paper and string. Seti was equally vigilant. When the children clamored for bicycles, John suggested buying one for each child. "No," said Seti, "we will buy just one for all of them." "But, my dear," John protested, "tricycles do not cost much." "That is true," she replied. "It is not the cost. But if they have just one, they will learn to give up to one another." So the children shared a single bicycle. Amazingly enough, the 4 children probably grew up with a level of creature comforts not that far above what Rockefeller had known as a boy. Except on Sundays, the girls wore simple gingham dresses and hand-me-downs. In later life, John Jr. confessed sheepishly that until the age of 8 he wore only dresses, because he was the youngest child and the 3 older siblings were girls. Rockefeller's home secretary saw much of the children because they liked to sit quietly and observed the mysterious clicking of the telegraph wires in her office. She described Rockefeller as extremely gentle with the children, but attached to certain fixed principles that he expounded with didactic, wearying repetition. The children were told so often that cards were sinful that they couldn't distinguish one card suit from another. To teach self-restraint, Rockefeller limited them to one piece of cheese daily. One afternoon, little Alta tackled on her younger sister Edith for having eaten 2 pieces of cheese, and Rockefeller professed shock at this Epicurean indulgence. As the secretary recalled, all that afternoon, whenever Edith came within hearing, her father would say slowly and impressively, "Edith was greedy." At another time, both little John and Alta called out, "Edith took the biggest." Repeatedly that afternoon, Mr. Rockefeller said in his impressive manner, Edith was selfish. Yet the thing to be husbanded most jealously was time. One could neither be too early nor too late. In fact, there was such a fetish about punctuality that it occasioned discernible anxiety among the children. Rockefeller's home secretary said that John Jr. had computed, down to the second, how long it took to get from her telegraph office to the schoolroom upstairs. After that, whenever I read to the children near school time, John would sit with watch in hand, and his rising was signal for the reading to stop and for the girls to follow him. Each morning before breakfast, Rockefeller led the family in prayer, meting out a penny fine to latecomers. Everyone took turns reciting from Scripture, and John or Seti elucidated difficult portions and prayed for guidance. Before bed, Seti listened to the children recite their prayers, and nothing could divert her from this sacred duty. They were encouraged to be active in prayer, especially at Friday night prayer meetings. As John Jr. recalled, at an early age they were encouraged to take part like the older people, either in a brief word of prayer or a word of personal experience. Sunday was a heavily regimented day, starting with morning prayers and Sunday school, then proceeding through afternoon prayer meetings and culminating with evening hymns. If the children had spare time, they couldn't read novels or worldly literature, but had to restrict themselves to the Bible and Sunday school literature. Strangely, didn't remember this as oppressive. As John Jr. observed, a day with such limitations as this would simply appall the modern child, and yet I have only the happiest recollections of the Sundays of my childhood. Seti turned Sunday into a day for serious reflection, asking the children to reflect upon such weighty maxims as, "He who conquers self is the greatest victor," or "The secret of sensible living is simplicity." Leading the children in an hour-long home talk, she asked each child to select a besetting sin, and then prayed with the child, asking for God's help in combating the sin. The implicit Baptist message was that people were inherently flawed, but, with prayer, willpower, and God's grace, infinitely capable of improvement. In business, John D. Rockefeller operated in a rough, virile world, whereas at home he was surrounded by a harem of doting women that included, at various times, his wife, sister-in-law, mother, mother-in-law, and 3 daughters. He seemed equally comfortable in these masculine and feminine spheres of existence. When they first got married, John and Seti lived with his mother Eliza, but she remained behind on Cheshire Street when they moved to Euclid Avenue. For the rest of her life, Eliza rotated among the homes of her 5 children, who provided her with more security than she had ever known with her prodigal husband. Evidently, she had some idea of where Bill lived, for she had a mailing address and forwarded letters to him from their grandchildren. In a confused manner, the grandchildren knew that their jolly grandfather lived an odd life somewhere out west, but the picture was left deliberately cloudy. It is hard to retrace Bill's movements with precision, for John D. seldom referred to him in either his business or private papers. His father's banishment was no less psychological than geographic. As best one can piece the story together in these middle years, Bill and his second wife, Margaret, moved to Illinois in 1867 and bought a 160-acre farm in Maroa, with John secretly sending money to help complete the purchase. As the area grew too settled for Bill, the couple moved again in 1875 to Freeport, Illinois, and here Margaret's wanderings at least ended. According to stories told later by their Freeport neighbors, Bill, known to them as Dr. William Livingston, was regarded as a profane braggart and con man, a notorious quack doctor who claimed to specialize in cancer and kidney treatments, and bought jugs of diuretic from a local druggist that he then resold on the road. Just as the long-suffering Eliza had endured long separations, it was now Margaret's turn to wait, as Bill disappeared for months before returning home with thick wads of money, always careful to fold a $100 bill on the outside. Yet Big Bill never entirely lost touch with his Rockefeller family. From out of the blue, he would materialize in Cleveland, jovial and carefree, and spend several days shooting at targets and playing his fiddle before disappearing for another year. John maintained a frosty civility toward his father, and their meetings tended to be both brief and infrequent. Later on, we shall have more to say about Bill's queer odyssey, for as his son grew famous, the whereabouts of Doc Rockefeller turned into a national obsession as reporters tried to reconstruct his renegade career. In marrying Laura Setty Spellman, Rockefeller had found a woman with his mother's gentle tenacity and religiosity. An 1872 photo shows a short, fragile, dark-haired woman with a wide face, high cheekbones, and deep, earnest eyes. Steeped in religious sentiment, she was more likely to be found meditating on a sermon than gossiping about a shopping expedition. Her marriage to John was harmonious, formal, and devoid of quarrels. Like her husband, Setty was fiercely democratic, disdaining conspicuous consumption and the snobbery of the rich. She was no respecter of persons, said her son. To her all men were brothers. She scorned frippery and dismissed fashion plates as vain, silly people. Though always supportive of her husband in his ambitions, she inveighed against the desperate struggle to obtain the almighty dollar. Even more of a pinch penny than John, she wore patches on her clothes and shocked one acquaintance by stating that a young woman needed just 2 dresses in her wardrobe. Even as her husband grew rich, she continued to perform much of the housework herself, employing 2 maids and a coachman when they could have afforded many more. Since he left the house each day and trafficked in a sinful world, John was a broader person than his wife, whose interests contracted sharply after she married. Despite her early blue-stocking bent, she lost much of her intellectual brightness as she made the transition from teacher to pedagogical mother, relentlessly molding her children. She liked to quote the maxim, "To be a good wife and mother is the highest and hardest privilege of woman." Where John derived escapist pleasure from the children, Laura took her maternal duties too seriously and was a firm, if loving, martinet. As her son said, she talked to us constantly about duty and displeasing the Lord and pleasing your parents. She instilled a personal consciousness of right and wrong, training our wills and getting us to want to do the things we ought to do. No less than her husband, she believed in the economical use of time. As one observer said, she realized her responsibilities, subjecting herself to a fixed daily regimen of duties, dividing her day off methodically into hours and minutes for each, but no moment might be misspent and no duty neglected. There was danger in the very congruence of values between John and Setty, for it made their intellectual life rather airless, allowing no room for disagreement. Had their opinions clashed, John might have been exposed to critical perspectives that could have saved him from his business excesses. Instead, his marriage strengthened his virtuous sense that he was one of God's soldiers, and therefore bound to be vilified by sinners. Setty was similarly braced for the terrible ostracism that came with Rockefeller's wealth. She was always like the Spartan mothers, said her daughter Edith. Everything which came to her she accepted, and she bore her frailty of body with uncomplaining patience. She had faith and trust in those she loved and never questioned or criticized. Setty's sister Lucy, Aunt Lute as the children called her, acted as something of a leavening influence in this arid setting. The close relationship of the 2 sisters was touching, since Lute, 2 years older, was an adopted child. By a strange coincidence, they looked so much alike that everybody assumed they were biological sisters. Lute was bright and cultivated, read contemporary literature, and gave John and Laura a window on secular culture when she read aloud after dinner. Though he was extremely fond of his sister-in-law, Rockefeller found her comically prim and spinsterish, and delighted in mimicking the way she lifted her skirts as she mounted the staircase. She would often turn and find him stealthily climbing the steps behind her, aping her in his cutaway coat, much to the family's amusement. In time, Lute developed the prissy manner of the proverbial old maid, and the children, for all their love, found her a little trying. But she was a beloved figure and an integral part of the family, and she introduced some needed cultural enrichment into a household that conformed rigidly to Christian doctrine. Chapter 8. Conspirators. The great industrial revolution that transformed America after the Civil War triggered an inflationary boom that swamped the country with goods. When this expanded supply led to lower prices and a deflationary bust, it set the pattern for the rest of the 19th century, which experienced huge economic advances, punctuated by treacherous slumps. Lured by easy profits, legions of investors rushed into a promising new field, and when big gluts developed from overproduction, they found it impossible to recoup their investment. This was especially true in new industries where people lacked the caution bred by experience and thus expanded with reckless abandon. As a result, many businessmen began to distrust unfettered competition and flirted with newfangled notions of cooperation, pools, monopolies, and other marketing arrangements that might curb production and artificially buoy prices. While all commodity prices fluctuated, crude oil prices were especially volatile. Based on locating deep, unseen pools, the industry was an unpredictable, nerve-wracking affair. Every time some lucky devil hit a gusher, this bonanza drove prices down. In 1865, producers began to torpedo wells by exploding gunpowder, later nitroglycerin, deep inside them to shake loose more oil, swelling the surplus. Within a year or two after the Civil War, the oil flood caused prices to skid to as low as $2.40 a barrel. They had traded as high as $12 in 1864, leading producers to contemplate forming a cartel to boost prices. The same predicament roiled refining, which had generated astronomical profits at first. As Rockefeller said tartly, the spoiled refiners were disappointed if they did not make 100% profit in a year, sometimes in 6 months. With sky-high profits and ridiculously low startup costs, the field had soon grown overcrowded. In came the tinkers and the tailors and the boys who followed the plow, all eager for this large profit, said Rockefeller. By the late 1860s, this dynamic produced a pervasive slump in the oil industry, keeping it depressed for the next 5 years. Low kerosene prices, a boon to consumers, were catastrophic for refiners, who saw the profit margin between crude and refined oil prices shrink to a vanishing point. Rampant speculation had so overbuilt the industry that total refining capacity in 1870 was triple the amount of crude oil being pumped. By then, Rockefeller estimated 90% of all refineries were operating in the red. At this bleak impasse, a leading Cleveland rival, John H. Alexander, offered to sell his interest to William Rockefeller at 10 cents on the dollar, as the entire industry faced ruin. Worse, the oil market wasn't correcting itself according to the self-regulating mechanism dear to neoclassical economists. Producers and refiners didn't shut down operations in the expected numbers, causing Rockefeller to doubt the workings of Adam Smith's theoretical invisible hand. So many wells were flowing that the price of oil kept falling, yet they went right on drilling. The industry was trapped in a full-blown crisis of overproduction with no relief in sight. Thus, in 1869, 1 year after his stellar railroad coup, Rockefeller feared that his wealth might be snatched away from him. As someone who tended toward optimism, seeing opportunity in every disaster, he studied the situation exhaustively instead of bemoaning his bad luck. He saw that his individual success as a refiner was now menaced by industry-wide failure, and that it therefore demanded a systemic solution. This was a momentous insight, pregnant with consequences. Instead of just tending to his own business, he began to conceive of the industry as a gigantic interrelated mechanism and thought in terms of strategic alliances and long-term planning. Rockefeller cited the years 1869 and 1870 as the start of his campaign to replace competition with cooperation in the industry. The culprit, he decided, was the overdevelopment of the refining industry, which had created ruinous competition. If this fractious industry was to be made profitable and enduring, he would have to tame and discipline it. A trailblazer who improvised solutions without any guidance from economic texts, he began to envision a giant cartel that would reduce overcapacity, stabilize prices, and rationalize the industry. If Rockefeller first expounded this idea among refiners, he was anticipated by the very drillers who later railed at his machinations. During the Civil War, they had formed an Oil Creek Association to curtail production and lift prices. And on February 1st, 1869, they again met in Oil City to create the Petroleum Producers Association to protect their interests. To devise a comprehensive solution for the industry, Rockefeller again needed money to create economies of scale, money to build cash reserves to endure downturns, money to heighten efficiency. And to buy in the many refineries that were a source of overproduction and confusion, we needed a great deal of money. The tricky part for Rockefeller and Flagler was how to supplement their capital without relinquishing control. The solution was to incorporate, which would enable them to sell shares to select outside investors. "I wish I'd had the brains to think of it," said Rockefeller. It was Henry M. Flagler. Luckily, many states had now passed laws permitting companies to incorporate. The one hitch, and it was a formidable one for Rockefeller, was that these firms couldn't own property outside their state of incorporation. To finesse this restriction would require endless legal execution. On January 10, 1870, the partnership of Rockefeller, Andrews, and Flagler was abolished and replaced by a joint stock fund called the Standard Oil Company, Ohio, with John D. Rockefeller as president, William Rockefeller as vice president, and Henry M. Flagler as secretary and treasurer. Besides echoing their Standard Works refinery, the name advertised the uniform quality of their kerosene at a time when consumers feared explosions from impurities. With $1 million in capital, $11 million in contemporary money, the new company became an instant landmark in business history, for there was no other concern in the country organized with such a capital, Rockefeller said. Already a mini-empire, Standard Oil controlled 10% of American petroleum refining, as well as a barrel-making plant, warehouses, shipping facilities, and a fleet of tank cars. From the outset, Rockefeller's plans had a wide streak of megalomania. As he told Cleveland businessman John Prindle, "The Standard Oil Company will someday refine all the oil and make all the barrels." Despite his lack of legal training, Henry M. Flagler drew up the Act of Incorporation. Nearly 60 years later, when this document was dredged up in a legal dispute, people were stunned by its simplicity. Instead of a fancy embossed paper dripping with seals, one reporter described it as a cheap-looking legal paper, faded yellow and of evident poor material, granting the Standard Oil Company the right to engage in business. This economical, no-nonsense approach appealed to investors, as did Rockefeller's decision that the leading men would receive no salary, but would profit solely from the appreciation of their shares and rising dividends, which Rockefeller thought a more potent stimulus to work. Standard Oil started out in a modest suite of offices in a 4-story building known as the Cushing Block on the public square. The office shared by Rockefeller and Flagler was somber and austere. Furnished with funereal dignity, it had a black leather couch and 4 black walnut chairs with elaborately carved backs and arms, plus a fireplace to provide warmth in winter. Rockefeller never allowed his office decor to flaunt the prosperity of his business, lest it arouse unwanted curiosity. From the start, he owned more shares of Standard Oil than anybody else and exploited every opportunity to augment his stake. Of the original 10,000 shares, he took 2,667, while Flagler, Andrews, and William Rockefeller each took 1,333. Stephen Harkness took 1,334, and the former partners of Rockefeller, Andrews, and Flagler divided another 1,000. The final 1,000 shares went to Oliver B. Jennings, William Rockefeller's brother-in-law, and the first outside investor. An adventurous figure, Jennings had gone to California during the gold rush and profited from selling supplies to prospectors. Rich investors did not line up to invest in Standard Oil, among other reasons because it was an inauspicious time for new ventures. On September 24, 1869, the infamous Black Friday, Jay Gould and Jim Fisk's scheme to corner the gold market by manipulating President Grant's monetary policy collapsed, fomenting financial panic and ruining more than a dozen Wall Street houses. Beyond that, the speculative aura of the oil industry still deterred many reputable businessmen. Rockefeller never forgot how his scheme was savagely derided as a rope of sand, or how sage businessmen told him that similar attempts to create a Great Lakes shipping cartel had misfired. "Either this experiment will result in a great success or a dismal failure," one aging financier warned him. As Rockefeller recalled, it was a course which older and more conservative businessmen shrank back from and regarded as reckless, almost to the point of insanity. Embittered by these skeptics and set to prove them wrong, Rockefeller managed to pay dividends of 105% on Standard Oil stock during the first year of operations, despite one of the worst financial bloodbaths in the industry's early history. The man with the hypertrophied craving for order was about to impose his iron rule on this lawless, godless business. As Ida Tarbell described Rockefeller in 1870, he was a brooding, cautious, secretive man, seeing all the possible dangers as well as all the possible opportunities in things, and he studied, as a player at chess, all the possible combinations which might imperil his supremacy. As he scanned the field of battle, the first target of opportunity lay close to home, the 26 rival Cleveland refiners. His strategy would be to subjugate one part of the battlefield, consolidate his forces, then move briskly on to the next conquest. His victory over the Cleveland refiners would be the first but also the most controversial campaign of his career. For his admirers, he was the annus mirabilis of John D. Rockefeller's life. while for his critics, it constituted the darkest chapter. The year revealed both his finest and most problematic qualities as a businessman. His visionary leadership, his courageous persistence, his capacity to think in strategic terms, but also his lust for domination, his messianic self-righteousness, and his contempt for those short-sighted mortals who made the mistake of standing in his way. What rivals saw as a naked power grab, Rockefeller regarded as a heroic act of salvation, nothing less than the rescue of the oil business. The state of the kerosene trade had further deteriorated in 1871 as prices sagged another 25%. As competitors skidded into bankruptcy, Standard Oil declared a 40% dividend with a small surplus to spare. Despite this, John D. Rockefeller sold off a small block of Standard Oil shares, the only time he ever lost heart momentarily, prompting brother William to lament, "Your anxiety to sell makes me feel uneasy." This discouragement was short-lived. In late 1871, Rockefeller engineered the covert acquisition of Bostwick and Tilford, New York's premier oil buyers, who owned barges, lighters, and a large refinery at Hunter's Point on the East River. A former Kentucky banker who had also dealt in cotton and grain and peddled Bibles, Jabez Abel Bostwick was a devout Baptist in the Rockefeller mold. Strict almost to sternness in his business dealings, preferring justice to sentiment, as one contemporary said. The purchase of Bostwick's firm gave Rockefeller a sophisticated purchasing agency at a critical moment. Oil prices were now being set in exchanges in western Pennsylvania, with powerful syndicates pushing aside the lone speculators who had once dominated trading. The move set a pattern of stealth that shadowed Rockefeller's career. Renamed J.A. Bostwick and Company, the newly acquired firm brazenly feigned independence of Standard Oil while acting as its cat's paw. On January 1st, 1872, the Standard Oil Executive Committee, bracing for the tumultuous events ahead, boosted the firm's capital from $1 million to $2.5 million and then to $3.5 million the next day. Among the new shareholders were several luminaries of Cleveland banking, including Truman P. Handy, Amasa Stone, and Stillman Witt. An intriguing new investor was Benjamin Brewster, a direct descendant of Elder Brewster of the Plymouth colony, who had made a fortune with Oliver Jennings during the California Gold Rush. It was a sign of Rockefeller's exceptional self-confidence that he gathered strong executives and investors at this abysmal time, as if the depressed atmosphere only strengthened his resolve. We were gathering information which confirmed us in the idea that to enlarge our own Standard Oil of Ohio and actually take into partners with us the refining interest would accomplish the protection of the oil industry as a whole. On January 1st, 1872, the Executive Committee made its historic decision to purchase certain refining properties in Cleveland and elsewhere. This seemingly innocuous resolution was the opening shot of a bloody skirmish that historians came to label the Cleveland Massacre. The mayhem in Cleveland began when Rockefeller struck a clandestine and richly ironic deal with Tom Scott, the overlord of the Pennsylvania Railroad. As noted, the Pennsylvania had threatened to blot out Cleveland as a refining center, prompting Rockefeller to solidify his ties with the Erie and New York Central systems. Rockefeller had no personal love of Scott and later branded him perhaps the most dominant autocrat that ever existed before or since in the railroad business of our country. Like many railroad executives, Scott had made his reputation during the Civil War by keeping railroad lines open between Washington and the North, and winning appointment as an assistant secretary of war. A shrewd, dashing man with long, curling side whiskers, he wore an enormous felt hat and exuded an aura of power. Of this master political manipulator, Wendell Phillips observed that, as he trailed his garments across the country, the members of 20 legislatures rustled like dry leaves in a winter's wind. Though Andrew Carnegie was a protege of Scott before going into the iron and steel business, the railroad executive didn't appeal to the sanctimonious Rockefeller. In business matters, however, Rockefeller stood ready to strike a deal with the devil himself. Since he dreaded an alliance between the Pennsylvania Railroad and Pittsburgh and Philadelphia refiners, he wanted to drive a wedge between them. They went on their knees to Scott for rates, Rockefeller said disparagingly of his rivals. They reverenced the Pennsylvania Railroad Administration, would do anything at their beck, would do anything to get in return help in the transportation of oil. So Rockefeller was receptive to an overture from Scott, which came unexpectedly from Peter H. Watson, an official of the rival Lake Shore Railroad and an intimate ally of Commodore Vanderbilt. As president of a lakeshore branch that joined Cleveland to Oil Creek, Watson had a personal stake in advancing the fortunes of his largest customer, Standard Oil. When Standard Oil expanded its capital in January 1872, Watson quietly pocketed 500 shares in another example of the growing back-scratching between Rockefeller and the railroads. It was probably through Watson that Commodore Vanderbilt discreetly invested $50,000 in Standard Oil that year. On November 30th, 1871, Watson met Rockefeller and Flagler at the St. Nicholas Hotel in New York and presented an audacious scheme devised by Tom Scott, who proposed an alliance between the three most powerful railroads, the Pennsylvania, the New York Central, and the Erie, and a handful of refiners, notably Standard Oil. To implement this, Scott had obtained a special charter for a shell organization bearing the blandly misleading name of the South Improvement Company, SIC. After the Civil War, the venal Pennsylvania legislature had created dozens of such charters by special enactment. These improvement companies possessed such broad, vague powers, including the right to hold stock in companies outside Pennsylvania, that some economic historians have christened them the first real holding companies. The Pennsylvania Railroad had a special purchase on these instruments of corporate power, and sometimes traded them for favors. Under the terms of the proposed pact, the railroads would sharply raise freight rates for all refiners, but refiners in the SIC would receive such substantial rebates, up to 50% off crude and refined oil shipments, that their competitive edge over rivals would widen dramatically. In the most deadly innovation, the SIC members would also receive drawbacks on shipments made by rival refineries. That is, the railroads would give the SIC members rebates for every barrel shipped by
you
other
would definitely do
refineries.
me a favor, right? I'm not
On
going to
shipments from western
Pennsylvania
Pennsylvania to Cleveland, for instance,
But yeah,
Standard
do me
Oil
a
would receive
favor,
a
though.
40-cent rebate on every barrel it shipped, plus another
Do me a
40 cents
favor,
for every
do me a
barrel
favor,
shipped to
do me a
Cleveland
favor.
by
Yeah,
competitors.
right. It's not necessarily convenient
One
for you.
Rockefeller
It's not
biographer has
necessarily
called the drawback
convenient for
an
you.
instrument of competitive
I'm
cruelty
exactly. I'm just trying to
unparalleled in
leverage.
industry.
I'm just trying to leverage.
Through another
You know what I'm
provision,
saying?
Standard Oil and
I'm
other
just trying to
SIC
leverage,
refiners would
you know what I'm
receive
saying?
comprehensive information about all oil
Not
shipped by their
reach.
competitors, invaluable in underpricing them. The SIC members were naturally sworn to secrecy about the inner workings of this alarming scheme.
That's what
All
I'm
in
saying.
all, it
The,
was
the
an
whole point,
astonishing
though,
piece of
of
knavery,
being like an influencer
grand-scale
is you're supposed to
collusion,
get like
such
new
as American industry had never witnessed.
clients, and you're
Though
supposed to like
Rockefeller and his
show someone like
co-conspirators
something new
contended
that
that
they
all
don't know about.
refiners were impartially
But,
invited to join the
the fuck
SIC,
exactly? I'm like,
the
who
group
doesn't
excluded
shop at
refiners
Amazon?
from Oil Creek and New York, and Standard Oil was indisputably the driving force.
Like, who has never used
Of the
Amazon
2,000
before? That's
shares
crazy.
issued,
Okay,
over one-fourth were held by John and William Rockefeller
Anyway.
and Henry Flagler, counting Jabez Bostwick and Oliver H. Payne, soon to be a leader of Standard Oil. The Rockefeller Group controlled 900 of 2,000 shares. The SIC president was Peter H. Watson, who held 100 shares and was also now a Standard Oil shareholder, thus ensuring the supremacy of the Cleveland refiners over the Pittsburgh and Philadelphia members of the group. Why did the nation's leading railroads offer Rockefeller and his confederates terms so generous as to render them all but omnipotent in oil refining? How did they benefit from this association? First, the railroads had engaged in such fierce internecine price wars that freight rates had fallen sharply. No less than the oil producers, they needed somebody to arbitrate their disputes and save them from their own cutthroat tactics. The cornerstone of the SIC was a provision that Standard Oil would act as evener for the three railroads and ensure that each received a predetermined share of the oil traffic. 45% of the oil shipped by SIC members would travel over the Pennsylvania Railroad, 27.5% on the Erie, and 27.5% on the New York Central. Unless the railroads had greater control over their business, Rockefeller knew, they could not make the divisions of business necessary so as to prevent rate cutting. Rockefeller would become their official umpire and try to govern their pool in a fair, disinterested fashion. As mentioned, the railroads also had an economic interest in greater consolidation among refiners to streamline their own operations. One other factor tempted the railroads to come to terms with Rockefeller. In a far-sighted tactical maneuver, he had begun to accumulate hundreds of tank cars, which would be in perpetually short supply. The SIC, soon exposed as an infamous conspiracy, was a masterful move in Rockefeller's quest for industrial domination. Both refiners and railroads were struggling with excess capacity and suicidal price wars. Rockefeller's supreme insight was that he could solve the oil industry's problems by solving the railroad's problems at the same time, creating a double cartel in oil and rails. One of Rockefeller's strengths in bargaining situations was that he figured out what he wanted and what the other party wanted, and then crafted mutually advantageous terms. Instead of ruining the railroads, Rockefeller tried to help them prosper, albeit in a way that fortified his own position. Later on, trying to distance himself from the SIC fiasco, Rockefeller scoffed at charges that he had been the ringleader. All along, he insisted, he knew it would fail, and had gone along simply as a tactical maneuver. We acceded to it because Tom Scott and the Philadelphia and Pittsburgh men we hoped would be helpful to us ultimately. We were willing to go with them as far as the plan could be used, so that when it failed, we would be in a position to say, now try our plan. Rockefeller's plan was to unify the industry under Standard Oil. By his own admission, he had not opposed the SIC on ethical grounds, but solely as a practical matter, convinced it wouldn't apply the needed discipline to member refiners. The scheme never bothered his conscience. It was right, an unreconstructed Rockefeller said in later years. I knew it as a matter of conscience. It was right before me and my God. If I had to do it tomorrow, I would do it again the same way, do it 100 times. Even in hindsight, he couldn't tolerate doubts about his career, but had to present it as one long triumphal march, sanctified by his religion. Rockefeller's assertion that he reluctantly followed the railroad's lead conveniently distorted the truth.